only what appears to happen. For we know that the negative never is simply negative, but is always self-negating from the start. In truth, in the movement of reflection, there is no simple negative at the outset, which is then negated, leading to the emergence of immediacy. Hegel suggests, however, that in the movement of self-negation, the negative is posited as the simple negative that is negated, leading to the emergence of immediacy. That is to say, the simple negative is placed by reflection before the immediacy that results, or in other words, is presupposed as the origin of the process through which immediacy emerges. The process of positing, of setzen, is not therefore purely the process of positing, for it is at one and the same time the process of presupposing the simple immediate negative, the negation of which gives rise to affirmative immediacy. Such affirmative immediacy, what is positive, thus arises as one side of a contrast. For as the reflexive negative negates itself, it comes to coincide with itself immediately, as opposed to being simply negative. The reflexive negative, remember, never was simply and immediately negative. But in the process of negating itself, it posits itself as simply negative, in contrast to the immediacy that emerges. The reflexive negative, thus, as it were, comes to have been simply negative in the very movement in which it turns into affirmative immediacy. What emerges in positing, therefore, is a difference, a contrast. Positing is the positing of immediacy in contrast to the simple negative. But that simple negative emerges with positive being as part of a contrast. This simple negative, therefore, is presupposed, posited prior to reflection, in the very movement of positing, in contrast to the immediacy that results from that reflection. So what I'm suggesting is that presupposing is the movement, one movement of positing a difference between the result and an origin. But there never was the origin. The origin arises, as it were, as an origin in the movement in which a result arises too. This means, therefore, that the simple immediate negative that is presupposed by reflection is nothing but a posit of reflection itself. It appears to come first, but it actually owes its prior status to the very movement of reflection to which it appears to give rise. Hegel confirms this point, I think, in the following lines. I quote, "The immediacy that reflection, as a process of sublating, presupposes for itself, is purely and simply a positiveness, an immediacy that is in itself sublating, that is not distinct from the return into self, and is itself only this movement of return." So absolute reflection is reactio ex nihilo. At the same time, it presupposes the nihil, through the negation of which immediacy is created. Indeed, Hegel claims that the processes of creating from nothing and of presupposing the nothing from which creation begins are one and the same process. In each case, what is posited or presupposed is explicitly dependent on the process of reflection. It is a positiveness, Gesetzsein, that necessarily points back to the reflection that posits it. Now, understood in this way, reflection, as absolute or positing reflection, is unable to give rise to genuinely independent immediacy. Because every immediacy it gives rise to is a positiveness, i.e. either presupposed or post-supposed. Hegel goes on to argue, however, that reflection must give rise to such immediacy because it must presuppose an immediacy that is external to it. Now, I claimed a moment ago that Henrich's account of presupposing is problematic. What is presupposed in absolute reflection is not something independent of reflection, but something explicitly negative. the immediate negative from which reflexive positing appears to begin. Henrich's account of presupposing serves very well, however, to explain the transition from absolute to external reflection. Henrich's argument goes like this. Insofar as reflection is not purely itself, is not pure positing, it must presuppose that which itself is not reflexive, that which is not merely posited by reflection. It must presuppose the negative of reflection. However, to the extent that what is presupposed really is the negative of reflection, really is non-reflexive, it must be non-negative, since reflection itself is utterly negative. The negative character of what is presupposed and its negative relation to reflection must therefore themselves be negated. Accordingly, what is presupposed by reflection as non-reflexive must be presupposed as wholly affirmative, immediate, and independent of reflection. In Henrich's own words, I quote, Das Gesetzte ist nicht mehr nur das Negative des letzten Wesens. Sein negativer Charakter ist selbst negiert. Es ist als unabhängig und eben das heißt vorausgesetzt. Now, in my view, this account, those words of Henrich, do not apply to presupposing as it occurs within the sphere of absolute reflection. They do, however, explain perfectly why reflection must become external reflection. If reflection presupposes the negative of itself, then what it presupposes must be wholly non-negative and non-reflexive. It must therefore be affirmative, immediate, and independent of reflection. It must thus be presupposed, or posited by reflection, as falling outside of reflection, and so is not posited by reflection at all. With the emergence of external reflection, essence undergoes another significant transformation. We've already seen that essence becomes productive rather than destructive of immediacy when it proves to be reflection. Absolute or positive reflection, however, produces no more than positive being, Gesetztsein. That is to say, it gives rise to being or immediacy that is explicitly dependent on reflection. Absolute reflection thus behaves rather like Nietzsche, who can never let anything be what it is, who always insists that what we relate to are our interpretations and our evaluation. When it becomes external reflection, however, reflection posits or presupposes genuine, freestanding immediacy. And yet, reflection is still not understood explicitly to produce or posit freestanding immediacy through its own reflexive activity. This is because such immediacy is presupposed by reflection as falling outside of reflection. It is presupposed by reflection, therefore, as that which is not posited by reflection, but found by it. External reflection itself posits immediacy, insofar as it places such immediacy outside itself. In doing so, however, external reflection suppresses the fact that it posits immediacy as lying outside it. As Hegel puts it, I quote Hegel, reflection, in its positing, immediately sublates its positing, and thus has an immediate presupposition. In his further analysis of external reflection, however, Hegel emphasizes the fact that reflection is itself responsible for positing its own immediate presupposition. External reflection presupposes or preposits immediacy, but negates or suppresses its own activity of positing, insofar as it sets itself in relation to an immediacy that is external to it. In doing so, however, reflection remains the activity of positing. It actively sets immediacy outside itself as its presupposition. As Hegel writes, external reflection is immediately equally a positing. that we simply revert to the earlier stage. It's not to say that what is presupposed by external reflection is merely positive being, and so not truly immediate after all. Then we'd just be back in absolute reflection. We've seen, however, that reflection cannot remain absolute. The very logic of reflection itself requires it to become external. Reflection must presuppose its own negative, but the negative of reflection is immediacy, so reflection must presuppose freestanding immediacy that is not merely positive being. Hegel's recognition that external immediacy is nonetheless positive immediacy does not therefore undermine its status as genuine immediacy, and does not therefore reduce it once more to merely positive being. Rather, we are taken forward to a new conception of immediacy. In the section on absolute or positing reflection, immediacy is understood merely to be posited by reflection, and so not to be truly immediate. In the next section on external reflection, by contrast, immediacy is understood to be genuinely immediate, but to fall outside of reflection. Now, immediacy is understood to be genuine immediacy, not just positiveness, and to be reflexively positive at one and the same time. Being reflexively positive or constituted does not, therefore, prevent such immediacy from being truly immediate, but is precisely what establishes it as genuine, freestanding within immediacy. So rather than reflection determining immediacy, reflection becomes a moment within immediacy. And of course still plays its role. This, I believe, is how reflection should be understood in the logic of the concept. Reflection does not underlie or ground or in any way actively determine the developments in the logic of the concept. Rather, it is a moment of those developments. This is made clear in these lines from the section on the universal concept. This is Hegel. Being has become an illusory being or a positiveness, and becoming has become a positing, and conversely, the positing or reflection of essence has sublated itself and restored itself as a being that is not positive, that is original. The concept is the interfusion of these moments. Now, this is not the place to explore the difference between the logic of the concept and the logic of essence. Nor do I deny that the concept of essence undergoes many more twists and turns after the account of reflection before it mutates into the concept proper. All I want to suggest is that the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of concept is prefigured in the process in which reflection shows itself to be immanent in immediacy. Reflection in its pure form has priority over the being that it posits. It is the active positing of such being. The lesson of the logic of reflection, however, is that reflection does not and cannot preserve its pure form, because it is intrinsically self-negating and self-sublating. Unlike the categories of being, however, reflection does not simply become something else. Rather, it turns itself into a moment of the very being that it constitutes. It proves to be immanent in being, rather than merely that which posits and presupposes being from a position of primacy. In the logic of reflection, therefore, we begin to see already why essence as a whole transforms itself into the concept. Essence becomes the concept because it is essentially reflexive. That is to say, it is thoroughly self-negating. It emerges initially as the truth of being, and as that upon which being depends. As it develops logically, however, it undermines its own priority and authority, and reveals itself to be one, albeit very important, moment of being. In this way, the logic of reflection and the logic of essence as a whole serves to prove that the truth of being is not just essence or reflection after all, but the concept, and eventually the idea. Hegel is thus not simply the foe of immediacy, as Sellers would have